My badge still worked when I walked into that glass conference room. HR called it realignment. The managing partner called it strategic evolution. I called it what it was: erasure. 7 years of compliance frameworks rewritten under someone else's name. By 9:05, my access was cut. By 9:06, my inbox was gone. But what they didn't know was that the system they depended on, the one I quietly built, was already watching them. And it remembers who told the truth. Comment if you've ever been called redundant, then stayed calm long enough to prove them wrong. When the new managing partner, Graham Rudd, arrived at Halberd Nash, he came with an entourage of consultants and buzzwords that never once mentioned integrity. Everything was about optics, how the firm looked, how it sounded, how it positioned itself in the evolving regulatory landscape. He called it modernization. I called it theater. Within weeks, the old systems I'd built, the checks, the verifications, the dual signature protocols, were labeled as inefficient. He wanted faster reports, cleaner visuals, smoother language for clients. Substance took a backseat to presentation. It didn't take long for him to find his mouthpiece: Ryan Hale. Ryan had once been the quiet analyst I mentored straight out of grad school. He'd shadowed me for months, learning how to trace discrepancies through audit trails, how to catch the faintest mismatch between source data and certification. He was sharp then, eager, respectful. But Graham liked people who nodded, not people who asked questions. Ryan learned to nod. Within 3 months, he had a new title, Associate Director of Audit Integration, and a new vocabulary that made my skin crawl. Suddenly, everything was about streamlined validation and strategic compliance. Words that looked good on PowerPoint slides but meant nothing when the numbers hit the ledger. Meetings changed too. I was still invited, but my slides were shorter each time, my speaking time cut in half, my name pushed lower on the presentation deck until it disappeared completely. Ryan spoke in smooth, confident phrases, dressed sharper, paused longer between sentences like he'd rehearsed them. Graham would lean back in his chair, smiling approvingly, as if he'd discovered brilliance. The truth was, he'd discovered obedience. My warnings about the risks of bypassing verification checks were brushed aside as old school. Once, I raised the issue of audit independence after seeing Ryan sign off on a client report he hadn't reviewed. Graham smirked and said, "Jennifer, not everything needs a microscope. Clients trust us because we move fast." I remember the laughter that followed. It wasn't loud, just collective. A polite chuckle from people who didn't want to be the next target. That was the moment I realized my position wasn't being questioned. It was being erased. The humiliation didn't come all at once. It dripped in slowly, like water through a crack. A project I'd led for years was reassigned. My direct reports were moved for better synergy. My desk was relocated to a smaller corner near the compliance archive room, closer to the data, they said. When my email access to client briefings was cut, I asked IT about it. They said it came from management. No one looked me in the eye. I watched as Ryan gave a presentation to a client using a framework I had written, every word, every structure mine, without a single mention of my name. He called it Atlas Ledger, a name I had once scribbled in a draft as a placeholder. Now it was his masterpiece. The client applauded. Graham shook his hand. I clapped too, just once, out of habit. That night, I walked past the glass conference room where my nameplate still hung on the door. It was smudged, probably from someone brushing against it. I wiped it clean with my sleeve and stood there for a moment, my reflection blending into the polished surface. I didn't feel anger, not yet. Just an ache. The kind that forms when something you built with integrity becomes a prop for someone else's performance. They thought they were cutting me out quietly, efficiently, surgically, but they underestimated how precisely I understood the systems they were now abusing. The same systems that logged every certification, every access, every signature. The same systems that never forgot. And as I stood there under the fluorescent hum of the empty office, I made a promise. Not to fight loudly, but to let their own signatures write their downfall. I didn't storm out or send any dramatic emails. I just stopped arguing. People mistake silence for surrender, but in my world, silence can mean calibration. I started collecting things. Not gossip, not grievances, but data. Every certification file that crossed my desk, every email that carried a signature it shouldn't have, every discrepancy quietly corrected before a report was sent. I mirrored everything to a private drive I kept encrypted at home. Each document had its metadata intact, every timestamp preserved. I didn't manipulate anything. I didn't need to. The truth, left untouched, is powerful enough when it's organized. My days at Halberd Nash became quieter. I nodded in meetings, smiled when spoken to, and took careful mental notes of every shortcut Graham encouraged. He wanted to look decisive, and Ryan wanted to look competent, a dangerous combination. Together, they pushed quarterly certifications through in half the time, skipping secondary verification entirely. The irony was almost poetic, the compliance department cutting its own compliance corners. One afternoon, Ryan forwarded me a draft of a client deliverable and asked me to polish the language. The report claimed all internal reviews were complete and independent. I knew they weren't. But instead of confronting him, I archived the message, logged its creation date, and filed it under a folder labeled Ethical Discrepancies. That folder would later become my insurance policy. Around that time, I reached out to Diane Mercer. She wasn't flashy, just the kind of corporate attorney who read footnotes twice and asked the right questions once. When I told her what was happening, she didn't react with outrage. She just nodded and said, "You're going to need to build your protection into the system itself." That sentence stayed with me. We began designing what she called an audit trigger, a buried clause within the Atlas Ledger architecture that would activate if my user credentials were ever revoked. It wouldn't cause damage. That wasn't the point. It would simply release the full, unedited compliance chain to the appropriate regulatory servers, complete with authorship metadata. Essentially, a silent mirror of truth. We disguised it within the normal update documentation for the quarterly client certification process. I made sure the clause aligned perfectly with Halberd and Nash's own transparency policy, one Graham loved to brag about, but never read. The beauty of it was that it required his approval to exist. I embedded it on page 6 of a routine certification alignment memo titled Q2 Framework Consolidation. It was dense, full of charts and compliance jargon, the kind of document no executive would ever fully read. The line that mattered was buried under a header called Ownership Attribution, written in clear legal syntax Diane had helped me draft. Authorship of the Atlas Ledger Framework is hereby attributed to the originating analyst of record as verified by audit-chain signatures in accordance with the firm's ethical ownership policy. It sounded harmless, procedural even, but once signed, it created a legal confirmation of my authorship under firm policy, cross-referenced in the metadata of the very system they were using to certify clients. Once that condition was met, the second part of the failsafe was ready. The trigger only needed 3 things: the confirmed authorship, my credentials deactivated, and my access revoked. Once all 3 conditions were met, the Atlas Ledger would execute a background process, compiling the last 60 days of unverified certifications and dispatching them to the Federal Compliance Portal. Every falsified report, every skipped review, every forged sign-off would be visible in one chain. I didn't write it as revenge. I wrote it as documentation. Diane called it poetic compliance. I called it insurance. Over the following weeks, I acted normal. I let Ryan take the spotlight, let Graham cut corners, let the board hear what they wanted to hear. My face in the mirror grew calmer by the day. When you know you're holding a truth that can't be erased, you stop needing to shout. By the end of that quarter, the clause had been signed, logged, and stored. The system recognized me as its author. And somewhere deep in the Atlas ledger, code. A quiet line waited for a signal it knew would come, the moment my name was removed from the firm's access list. The first cracks didn't look like cracks at all. They looked like efficiency. Graham praised Ryan in every meeting for delivering ahead of schedule. Clients loved the speed, and the partners loved the margins. They didn't notice that the certification reports were starting to sound the same. Boilerplate language recycled from older audits, numbers conveniently rounded, discrepancies explained away with vague footnotes. I noticed, of course. I always did. But I stayed quiet, letting the pattern build itself. The more they praised each other, the sloppier they became. Compliance wasn't a system anymore. It was a performance. One morning, I walked past the glass boardroom and saw Graham standing in front of a slide titled Atlas Ledger 2.0. My stomach turned. They were using my architecture, my logic chains, my data lineage to sell a new proprietary framework to a global client. Ryan stood beside him, explaining metrics I knew he didn't understand. The automated reconciliations reduce audit time by 40%, he said proudly. I could see my old phrasing embedded in his slides, even my color coding. Graham grinned, bragging that the firm's next certification cycle would be fully automated. What he didn't realize was that the automation he boasted about was already recording his every move. Each time they bypassed a verification step, the system logged it under their credentials. The deeper they buried my work under theirs, the stronger the evidence grew. I stopped attending client calls. I spent my days quietly reviewing internal memos, noting where policies were rewritten to allow executive discretion on risk weighting. It was a clever phrase. It sounded compliant, but erased accountability. Graham approved it personally. The irony of watching a compliance firm build its own non-compliance policy was almost cinematic. Ryan started acting different too. He began avoiding eye contact when we crossed paths. Once, he stopped by my desk with a forced smile and said, "You know, I really appreciate everything you taught me." His tone carried guilt disguised as politeness. I just nodded. He lingered, as if expecting me to offer reassurance, then walked away. That was the last genuine conversation we had. A week later, he presented a client portfolio using an updated Atlas report that was missing several mandatory audit steps. He'd replaced my layered review process with a single approval field labeled Expedited Verification. I remember sitting in the back of that meeting room, my hands folded, watching the entire compliance chain bend until it was barely recognizable. They thought they were evolving. They were incriminating themselves. Late that night, I stayed in the office. Long after the others left, I pulled up the internal audit dashboard and watched as the Atlas ledger logged a growing string of skipped validations. Every skipped entry added to a cumulative discrepancy chain that would automatically dispatch once my ID deactivated. It was all happening in real time, invisible, but irreversible. They were writing their own evidence, line by line, signature by signature. I didn't need to alter anything. All I had to do was let the system run. By the end of that month, Graham had promised a record-breaking quarter. Ryan had become his unofficial right hand. The firm buzzed with energy, oblivious to the quiet countdown running in the background. They'd built a tower of paper success balanced on falsified reports and self-signed approvals, and at its base sat Atlas Ledger, patient, compliant, and waiting for the one command that would unlock its memory. I remember thinking, as I closed my laptop that night, how fragile power looks when it depends on ignorance. They were celebrating a victory they hadn't earned, and I was preparing for the silence that would follow when their own system told the truth they'd refused to hear. It happened on a Tuesday morning, sharp and silent, like most executions in corporate life. My calendar showed a check-in with HR at 9 a.m. I'd been around long enough to know what that meant. The air in the hallway already felt pre-cleansed, like they'd rehearsed the conversation before I arrived. I walked into the small conference room with my notepad and coffee, both useless accessories. Inside were three faces: Graham, pretending calm, the HR director, sympathetic but detached, and a junior attorney I'd never seen before, whose eyes stayed fixed on the folder in front of her. Graham smiled as if to soften the blow. "Jennifer, thank you for joining us. I'll get straight to it. The firm's restructuring its compliance function. We're moving toward an integrated reporting model, and unfortunately, your role overlaps with our new structure." Overlaps. That was their word for deletion. I nodded once, said nothing. The HR director cleared her throat. "Your access will be deactivated immediately following this meeting. It will coordinate your transition." Transition. They made it sound like a job promotion instead of an execution. Graham kept talking about appreciation, legacy, all the words people use when they're already halfway out of guilt. I didn't hear most of it. I was too aware of my badge resting in my palm, still warm from the elevator sensor. I handed it over when they asked, and as the magnetic strip left my skin, I felt the faint click of inevitability. Somewhere, in a server room on the 12th floor, the Atlas Ledger registered my deactivation. That was the first condition met. The second followed within seconds. My credentials were removed from the internal compliance system. The third, confirmation of authorship, had been secured months ago when Graham signed the Q2 Framework Consolidation Memo without reading it. At exactly 9:03 a.m., the trigger completed its chain. Atlas Ledger initiated the background process Diane and I had coded to perfection. It began pulling every certification report that bore Graham's or Ryan's digital signature without corresponding review metadata. Then it cross-verified those reports against the firm's submission schedule. Within minutes, the compiled discrepancies, 73 documents in total, were packaged into a regulatory dispatch file, encrypted under the Federal Compliance Integrity Protocol. At 9:06, the file transmitted automatically to the secure government inbox listed in Halberd Nash's transparency charter. It wasn't a hack. It was a feature, one they'd approved themselves. I walked out of the room quietly while Graham was still talking about transition support. I passed the open office bullpen where screens glowed with spreadsheets and charts, everyone pretending not to notice me. My phone buzzed as I stepped into the elevator. One notification. Audit dispatch. Confirmation received. I exhaled, slow and steady. It was done. Outside, the morning light felt colder, too bright for what had just unfolded. I crossed the street to the cafe opposite the building, the same place I used to buy tea during late nights before deadlines. I sat by the window, ordered nothing, and watched as the reflection of the Halberd Nash logo shimmered against the glass. Inside, people were still working, still confident in their false safety. They didn't yet know that the very system they'd flaunted in client decks was now speaking for itself. At 9:12, another message appeared on my screen from Diane. Transmission verified. Regulatory acknowledgement pending. I smiled faintly. She'd kept it as brief and clinical as always. By 9:17, the confirmation arrived. Subject line, Regulatory Acknowledgement. Compliance Dispatch Received. Ref. Atlas Ledger. It was over. Not in a loud, dramatic sense. No alarms, no shouting. But in the quiet, bureaucratic way truth asserts itself through documentation. Inside that firm, audit coordinators would soon start seeing error notifications they couldn't explain. Missing signatures, blocked access to certain ledgers, timestamps that didn't align. The more they tried to fix it, the deeper they'd go. Every log would lead back to the same user chain, G. Rudd and R. Hale. Every skipped verification step would be exposed as a recorded decision. I imagined Ryan's expression when IT told him that the system had flagged him as a non-compliant author. He'd probably call it a glitch. He always called problems glitches. Graham would call an emergency meeting, demand control of the narrative, and tell PR to prepare a statement about data irregularities. But by then, the regulators would already have the full chain. Nothing could be deleted. The ledger had preserved everything: their signatures, their timestamps, their shortcuts. That was the point. Truth as a system, not a speech. I didn't stay to watch the chaos. I sat in that cafe watching morning turn into late morning and thought about how strange it was that my revenge had no noise. Just a silent pulse through servers, one line of code at a time, rewriting accountability where arrogance once stood. They'd taken my name off the reports. The system just wrote it back in. By noon, the firm was already unraveling, and I hadn't even moved from my seat at the cafe. The first clue came in the form of a breaking banner, scrolling across a muted television above the counter. Regulatory Inquiry, launched into Halberd Nash Consulting Group. I didn't need sound to understand what it meant. The photo that flashed beside the headline showed Graham, mid-laugh, taken from a recent trade interview. That smile would age 10 years before sundown. My phone began to vibrate endlessly. Alerts, forwarded articles, snippets from former colleagues who still had my number. "Are you seeing this?" one text read. "What happened?" another asked. I didn't reply. Across the street, I saw movement behind the glass walls of the office. People walking quickly, faces pale, phones to their ears. The rhythm of panic. I pictured Ryan at his desk, reading the first internal memo from IT describing an unexpected automated submission of compliance documentation to federal regulators. They try to downplay it, of course, but within minutes, the media would connect the dots between that submission and the firm's own transparency charter. By 1 p.m., a leaked email hit the press. An internal chain showing Graham ordering Ryan to approve quarterly certifications without secondary verification for efficiency purposes. The timestamp was precise, the signature digital, irrefutable. The story spread like wildfire across the professional network feeds. Every audit firm in the city was watching. Halberd Nash, the firm that once lectured on ethical leadership, was suddenly synonymous with fraud. Ryan's name trended under a headline that called him the poster child of corporate shortcuts. Graham went on defense, releasing a statement to the press about internal miscommunication and isolated procedural oversights. It was exactly the kind of vague deflection I had predicted. He blamed systems malfunction, unaware that the system in question had merely told the truth. Regulators weren't amused. By late afternoon, the Securities and Exchange Commission confirmed a full audit inquiry. The moment that announcement went public, the firm's largest institutional client froze their contracts. Then came the domino effect. 2 more clients suspended engagements. One demanded refunds for misrepresented certifications. Within hours, the company's stockholders convened an emergency call. Someone leaked that too. A journalist quoted an insider saying, "The managing partner's signature authorized the automation that triggered this entire mess." The irony must have been bitter. Graham had signed that very clause himself months earlier, calling it routine compliance housekeeping. The same document now served as the backbone of the Regulators' case file. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. Watching a system collapse under its own falsity isn't satisfying. It's instructive. Truth doesn't shout. It echoes. Around 3:00 p.m., my attorney Diane called. Her voice was calm, measured. "They reached out," she said. "The Regulators confirmed receipt of the full ledger, and they've verified the authorship trail. You're clean." "They're not." I thanked her quietly. "They'll likely reach out for comment," she continued. "Do you want me to handle it?" I thought for a second. "No, not yet." Let the paper trail speak. That's what the Atlas Ledger was built for, to let documentation carry the weight of justice. I imagined the boardroom then, Graham standing in front of a projection of his own emails, sweating through his designer's shirt, barking at legal counsel to contain exposure. Ryan sitting next to him, pale, eyes down, realizing too late that the shortcuts he'd taken were now being audited line by line. By evening, financial networks picked up the story. Halberd Nash under investigation for certification manipulation, the anchor read. Analysts speculated about bankruptcy, partner withdrawals, reputational implosion. The footage cut to Graham outside the building, dodging questions from reporters, his voice tight as he said, "We take these matters seriously." I knew he meant it this time. Somewhere between 6:00 and 7:00, my inbox lit up again. A new message. Subject: urgent. Ownership clarification request. It was from Halberd and Nash Legal. The email's tone was cautious, polite. "We are seeking to confirm authorship of the Atlas Ledger framework and to discuss potential terms for resolution." Translation: they were admitting defeat, trying to buy back credibility. I didn't open it right away. I read the headline again, the one flashing across every financial feed. Compliance system turns on its creators. I hadn't turned anything. I had simply designed it to recognize the absence of honesty as a failure state. The firm had reached that state at 9:03 a.m. when they deactivated my access. The rest was consequence. As the sun began to set, the Halberd Nash logo on the building caught the orange light, half of it in shadow. It looked like a relic already. I finished my tea, stood, and whispered the same words I'd once written in my private log months earlier. Integrity doesn't fight for attention. It waits for evidence. That day, evidence had done all the talking. The next morning, the emails were still coming. Journalists asking for interviews, regulators asking for statements, recruiters asking if I was open to strategic opportunities. I ignored all of them except one. The subject line read, Director of Compliance Innovation, Meridian Advisors. I opened it, expecting another form letter, but the message was personal. "We've followed your work," it said. "You built a framework that exposed what everyone else ignored. We'd like you to lead a new division. Your name, your methods, full transparency." I stared at those words for a long time. After years of being erased, someone was offering to build something with my name engraved into its foundation. I accepted the interview, and 2 weeks later, the offer. Meridian wasn't like Halberd and Nash. Their offices were quieter, less polished, but honest. They didn't pretend compliance was glamorous. They treated it as survival. When I joined, I rebuilt the Atlas Ledger under a new name, audit-chain, a cleaner version, one without the buried triggers or fail-safes. This one didn't need protection. It was protection itself. We implemented it across 3 major clients in the first quarter, each one adopting the framework that had once been dismissed as too rigid. Regulators praised the model publicly for restoring trust in audit transparency. I didn't feel vindicated in the dramatic sense. It was quieter than that. Sometimes justice doesn't sound like applause. It sounds like no one questioning your integrity anymore. From afar, I watched Halberd Nash shrink. Graham resigned for personal reasons. Ryan's industry license was suspended indefinitely for failure to ensure control compliance. Their investors pulled out. Their clients never returned. The firm still existed technically, but stripped of influence, reduced to a footnote in a governance seminar titled The Price of Convenience. I didn't sue them. I didn't need to. Their downfall wasn't an act of revenge. It was the natural audit of their own decisions. At Meridian, my team started calling my process the Reins Method, a quiet tribute to what it represented. Accountability written into architecture. I never corrected them, though my last name wasn't Reins. I liked the symbolism. It reminded me that systems, like people, can either conceal or reveal truth depending on who builds them. One afternoon, I stood by the window of my new office overlooking the skyline, sunlight catching the glass towers, the same city that had once made me invisible. It looked smaller now, not because it changed, but because I finally understood scale. Success isn't about being louder than those who ignored you. It's about building something that no one can ignore anymore. As I turned back to my desk, the Clarion chain dashboard blinked with a green status light, steady, unbroken. For the first time in years, I felt the calm that comes from knowing the system and the truth were finally aligned. A month after the investigation closed, I walked back into Halberd Nash's building, not as an employee, not even as a guest, just as someone reclaiming the last thing they hadn't taken, closure. The lobby smelled the same, polished marble, stale coffee, and expensive air freshener pretending to be success. The receptionist didn't recognize me, and I didn't offer an introduction. I took the elevator to the 6th floor, the old compliance wing, where my nameplate had once hung beside a frosted glass door. The hallway felt smaller now, stripped of noise and pretense. My old office was dark, the lights motion-activated. As I stepped inside, they flickered on, revealing what was left of the past: empty desks, scattered binders, a forgotten whiteboard half erased but still faintly showing a phrase I'd once written. Verification is proof of respect. I smiled at that. On the wall outside the conference room was a blank rectangle of wall space, 4 screw holes still visible. That was where my framed compliance certificate had hung before someone quietly removed it. I reached into my bag and pulled it out, the original, the one I had taken home the day after they fired me. The glass was cracked at the corner, but intact. I lined it up with the holes, pressed it against the wall, and secured it back into place. The click of the frame settling felt final, like the system closing its last open file. Then I pulled a small, yellow, sticky note from my folder, wrote 6 words, and stuck it to Graham's old desk before turning to leave. Next time, certify what you understand. No anger, no sarcasm, just a reminder written in the language they once ignored. On my way out, I passed a cleaning crew polishing the floor. One of them glanced at the certificate now hanging straight on the wall and said, "That looks new." I smiled. Not new, just corrected. Outside, the afternoon sun caught the building's glass facade, reflecting the city back onto itself. In that mirror, I saw my own reflection for a moment. Not erased, not diminished, just clear. Some lessons don't need revenge. They just need record-keeping. I used to believe that success in a workplace came from visibility, speaking up in meetings, showing initiative, staying late when others left. But what this experience taught me is that real strength doesn't always make noise. It lives quietly, in preparation, in the discipline of keeping receipts when no one else is looking, I didn't fight Graham and Ryan with shouting matches or public confrontation. I fought them with documentation, clarity, and patience. Every signed form, every ignored policy, every overlooked verification was evidence of their own carelessness and proof of my consistency. When they erased my name from the system itself remembered me because I had built it that way. That was the hidden power, not defiance, but foresight. The truth is, arrogance always underestimates patience. In every office, there are people like Graham, leaders who confuse performance with progress, and people like Ryan, those who trade ethics for advancement. But systems collapse, not when rebels attack them, but when their own shortcuts finally catch up. My silence wasn't weakness. It was architecture. I learned that revenge doesn't have to destroy anyone. It just needs to reveal what was already broken. When you build something with integrity, it becomes your shield long after they've forgotten your name. I didn't win by being louder. I won by being thorough. The lesson wasn't about outsmarting them. It was about outlasting them through truth. Integrity doesn't need applause. It just needs to be documented. How to get started today. Keep a private record of your work, document contributions, emails, and results. Facts protect better than feelings. Read what you sign. Never assume a manager or partner understands the fine print better than you. Build systems that remember you. Embed your value in your process, not your presence. Stay calm in injustice. Silence used strategically is preparation, not surrender. If you've ever been underestimated or quietly replaced, remember this: you don't have to shout to be heard. Sometimes the best revenge is letting your integrity do the talking. Comment below if you've ever had to let the truth speak for you. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories about quiet power and corporate redemption.